The Boston Garden pulsed with an energy that seemed almost electric on that April evening in 1968. 15,000 tickets had been sold, but the venue's capacity restrictions meant only 10,000 people could fill the seats. Outside, the spring air carried an unusual tension, the kind that made people walk a little faster, glance over their shoulders a little more often. The city had been on edge for days, and everyone could feel that something was about to break. Inside the arena, the stage lights bathed everything in shades of red and gold, casting long shadows across the eager faces of the crowd. Young people filled every corner, dressed in their finest clothes, ready to witness the godfather of soul himself perform. The atmosphere was supposed to be celebratory, but underneath the excitement there was something else, an undercurrent of frustration, anger, and uncertainty that had been building for weeks. The wooden seats creaked as people settled in, conversations rising and falling like waves. Groups of friends huddled together, some laughing nervously, others speaking in serious tones about the events that had shaken the nation. Vendors moved through the aisles selling refreshments, but even they seemed hurried, eager to finish their rounds before the main act began. The air conditioning struggled against the body heat of thousands, creating a warm, almost suffocating atmosphere that added to the tension everyone felt, but nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. James Brown's tour bus arrived at the back entrance just as the opening acts finished their sets. The 44-year-old performer stepped out, wearing his signature processed hair and a burgundy suit that shimmered under the backstage lights. His band members followed, carrying instruments and speaking in hushed tones about the situation outside. Radio reports had been coming in all afternoon about disturbances in other cities across America. The news from Memphis was still fresh, still raw, and everyone from the stagehands to the security personnel knew that tonight was different from any other concert. The mayor's office had called twice that afternoon, and there had been serious discussions about cancelling the show entirely, but James had refused. He believed in the power of music to heal, to unite, and to give people an outlet for their emotions. He also knew that cancelling would be seen as surrender, as giving in to fear, and that was something he could never accept. His manager, Ben Bart, walked beside him carrying a clipboard thick with papers, contracts, set lists, and emergency protocols that had been hastily drafted just hours before. The backstage area buzzed with unusual activity. Normally, concert preparations followed a familiar rhythm, but tonight everything felt different. Security personnel outnumbered the usual staff 3-1, their faces serious, their walkie-talkies crackling with constant updates from the streets outside. Technical crew members moved with purpose, double-checking every cable, every amplifier, every microphone connection. There could be no technical failures tonight, no reasons for delays or interruptions. Everything had to be perfect, smooth, seamless. The city officials stood in a small circle near the stage entrance, their faces drawn with concern. Police Chief Matthews wiped his forehead with a handkerchief despite the cool temperature, his eyes constantly scanning the growing crowd through the gap in the curtains. The mayor's representative, a thin man named Douglas with wire-rimmed glasses, kept checking his watch as if time itself might solve their problems. They had made a controversial decision earlier that day, to allow the concert to proceed, but to broadcast it live on public television, hoping that keeping people at home watching their screens might prevent them from taking to the streets. It was a calculated risk, an unprecedented move that had never been tried before in Boston's history. The production crew from WGBH-TV scrambled to set up cameras and lighting for the broadcast, adding another layer of complexity to an already tense situation. Heavy television cameras were positioned at strategic angles around the arena, their operators testing shots and adjusting focus while trying to remain invisible to the arriving audience. Kevin White, Boston's mayor, had staked his reputation on this decision, believing that music might be the one thing that could keep the peace when everything else had failed. He stood in his office across town, watching multiple television monitors, one hand on the telephone ready to make the call if things went wrong. His advisors surrounded him, some supporting the decision, others openly critical, all of them understanding that the next few hours would define his leadership during one of the most challenging periods in the city's modern history. In neighborhoods throughout Boston, families gathered around television sets, drawn by the unusual announcement that had been broadcast repeatedly throughout the day. The decision to televise the concert for free had sparked debates in living rooms, community centers, and corner stores. Some praised it as innovative thinking, others condemned it as appeasement. But regardless of opinion, everyone agreed on one thing. Tonight mattered in ways that went far beyond entertainment. James Brown stood in his dressing room, the door closed against the chaos outside. He sat before a mirror surrounded by light bulbs, but he wasn't looking at his reflection. His mind was elsewhere, processing the weight of the moment. His valet, Danny Ray, moved quietly around the room, preparing the stage costumes. 3 different outfits for 3 different segments of the show. The famous cape was hung carefully on a wooden hanger, its purple fabric catching the light. James had built his career on giving audiences more than they expected, on pushing himself beyond normal human limits of energy and performance. But tonight required something different. Tonight required wisdom, restraint, and the ability to read a crowd that might explode at any moment. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Reverend Michael Haynes, a local community leader who had been instrumental in convincing city officials to let the concert proceed. The Reverend's presence brought a sense of calm authority. He spoke quietly with James about the responsibility they both carried, about the young people in the audience who needed guidance, who needed to see strength without aggression, passion without destruction. James listened carefully, nodding occasionally, his expression serious. He had performed thousands of shows across America and around the world, but he had never felt pressure quite like this. The music would matter tonight, certainly, but the words between the songs might matter even more. Outside the arena, the streets of Boston's Roxbury neighborhood showed signs of the tension that had gripped the city. Windows of some businesses had been boarded up as a precaution. Police cars moved slowly through intersections, officers inside watching, waiting, hoping their presence wouldn't be needed. Small groups of young people gathered on corners, some heading toward the garden, others simply standing, talking, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in recent days. The grief was real and widespread, touching every family, every community, every person who had hoped for change and suddenly felt that hope slipping away. Teachers, preachers, parents, and community organizers had spent the past days trying to channel that grief into something constructive, but the anger was like a living thing, unpredictable and dangerous. Radio stations played music continuously, interrupting only for news updates and appeals for calm. DJs spoke in measured tones, choosing their words carefully, knowing that a single phrase could either soothe or inflame. The entire city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the night would go. Back at the garden, the opening acts had done their job, warming up the crowd, building energy, creating anticipation. Now the stage was being reset for the main performance. James Brown's band took their positions, each musician checking their instrument one final time. The horn section, dressed in matching suits, ran through a quick warm-up exercise. The drummer, Clyde Stubblefield, adjusted his seat height and tested his snare drum, the sharp crack echoing through the arena. The bass player, Sweet Charles Sherrill, plugged in his instrument and nodded to the sound engineer, confirming the levels were correct. Guitar player Jimmy Nolan fingered a few chords, his distinctive chicken scratch rhythm style ready to drive the performance. These musicians had played together for years, developing a telepathic understanding that allowed them to follow James's spontaneous changes and extended improvisations. But tonight, they had been briefed on something additional. Be ready for anything, stay alert, and above all, don't stop playing unless James signals them to stop. The music had to continue no matter what happened in the audience. The lights dimmed, and the crowd's noise level rose immediately. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. In living rooms across Boston, people adjusted their television sets, gathering family members to watch. The experiment was beginning. Would music be enough? Would one man's voice, one man's performance, one man's appeal to reason and unity be sufficient to prevent the chaos that had consumed other American cities? Nobody knew the answer, but in minutes, they would start to find out. The introduction music erupted through the massive speakers, and the crowd exploded into cheers that shook the very foundations of the Boston Garden. Danny Ray, James Brown's longtime master of ceremonies, stepped into the spotlight, wearing a glittering jacket that caught every beam of light. His voice boomed through the microphone with practiced showmanship, building the anticipation with each carefully chosen word. "Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready?" The response was deafening. 10,000 voices united in a roar of excitement that seemed to push against the walls of the arena. "I said, are you ready?" The volume doubled. People were on their feet now, pressing toward the stage, the energy becoming almost tangible. Danny Ray stretched out the moment, understanding that the build-up was part of the magic, part of what made a James Brown show unlike anything else in entertainment. The hardest working man in show business, the godfather of soul, Mr. Dynamite. Ladies and gentlemen, James Brown. The band hit the opening notes with precision, and James burst onto the stage with the explosive energy that had made him legendary. At 44 years old, he moved like a man half his age, spinning, sliding, dropping to his knees and bouncing back up without missing a beat. The burgundy suit reflected the stage lights as he grabbed the microphone and launched into his first song. The audience response was immediate and overwhelming, but even in the midst of the performance, James's eyes scanned the crowd, reading the mood, sensing the underlying tension that lurked beneath the celebration. The first 3 songs went exactly as planned, high energy, perfectly executed, with the band locked into the tight groove that had made them famous. James worked the stage from corner to corner, engaging with every section of the audience, making each person feel like he was performing directly for them. The horn section punctuated his movements with sharp, synchronized blasts. The rhythm section kept the beat so steady and hypnotic that bodies moved involuntarily to the music. Sweat began to form on James's forehead as he delivered his trademark screams and vocal improvisations, pushing his voice to its limits and beyond. The television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the performance into homes throughout Boston and the surrounding areas. In the control room, the director made quick decisions about which angles to use, which shots best captured the electricity of the moment. The production crew had never worked under such pressure, knowing that thousands of people might be making critical decisions based on what they saw on their screens. The broadcast was more than entertainment. It was a social experiment, a desperate attempt to use the power of culture to prevent catastrophe. And for the first few songs, it seemed to be working. The energy in the arena was intense but controlled, passionate but focused on the performance, rather than the frustrations that had brought the city to this dangerous moment. Then, midway through the 4th song, something changed. A group of young people near the front began pushing toward the stage with more aggression than enthusiasm. Security personnel moved to intercept them, and suddenly the careful balance that had been maintained began to tip. More people surged forward, not with violent intent necessarily, but with an intensity that threatened to overwhelm the barriers. James saw it happening and never stopped performing, but his mind was racing through options, considering responses, calculating the best way to prevent the situation from escalating. The band kept playing, following his lead, but they too sensed the shift in energy. What had been joyful exuberance was transforming into something more chaotic, more dangerous. Police officers positioned around the perimeter took a step forward, hands moving toward their equipment, preparing for the possibility that they might need to intervene. In the broadcast booth, the director's hand hovered over the button that would cut the feed if things got out of control. Mayor White, watching from his office, leaned closer to the screen, his jaw clenched, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether his gamble had paid off or whether he had made a terrible mistake that would haunt his administration forever. More young people jumped onto the stage, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and something deeper, a need to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged as more than invisible citizens of a city that had marginalized them for too long. Security guards rushed forward, creating a human barrier between the performers and the crowd members who had breached the stage. James continued singing, but his attention was divided now. He could see the confusion in the eyes of the security personnel, could sense their uncertainty about how to handle the situation without making it worse. One wrong move, one overreaction, and the entire arena could erupt into chaos. The situation was a powder keg, and everyone present understood that something had to happen quickly. James made a decision in that split second, a decision that would define not just the night but his entire legacy. He stopped singing mid-phrase and signaled the band to cut the music. The sudden silence was shocking, almost painful after the overwhelming volume of the performance. 10,000 people fell quiet, confused by the interruption, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the young people on the stage froze, uncertain what this pause meant. James Brown stepped forward to the microphone, his chest heaving from exertion, sweat running down his face, but his voice was completely calm when he spoke. Wait a minute now. The authority in his tone was unmistakable, not aggressive, not angry, but absolutely commanding. He looked directly at the security guards who were attempting to remove the young people from the stage. "Step back," he told them. "Let me handle this." The guards hesitated, looking at each other, uncertain whether to follow orders from a performer rather than their supervisors. But something in James's demeanor convinced them. They stepped back, still alert, still ready, but giving him space to work. James turned his attention to the young people on the stage, making eye contact with each of them individually. His expression was serious, but not hostile. "Now listen," he said, his voice carrying throughout the silent arena and into homes across the city. "I asked the police to step back because I thought I could get some respect from my own people." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. This wasn't a scolding or a lecture. It was an appeal to pride, to dignity, to the better nature of everyone present. He continued speaking, his words measured and deliberate. "Now I'm right here with you. I'm not going to leave. We're going to finish the show together, but you've got to help me. Are you going to help me?" A few voices responded affirmatively, but many remained silent, watching, listening, trying to understand what he was asking of them. James pressed on. "I don't think I'm asking too much. You came here to see a show, and I'm trying to give you the best show I can give. But I can't do it with you up here on the stage. I need you to go back to your seats and let me do my job. Can you do that for me?" His tone was respectful, treating them not as troublemakers to be controlled, but as partners in creating something meaningful. The young people on the stage began to nod, their body language shifting from defiance to cooperation. Slowly, one by one, they moved toward the edge of the stage and stepped down, returning to the audience. But even as they complied, more people from other sections began moving forward, the energy still unstable, still dangerous. James could see that words alone weren't going to be enough. He needed to give them something more, something that would channel their emotions into something constructive rather than destructive. The Godfather of Soul made another decision in that moment. He would be completely honest, completely vulnerable with his audience. "Look," he said, and his voice carried a different quality now, less the entertainer and more the human being. "I know you're hurt. I know you're angry. I feel the same way. We've all lost something precious, something we can never get back, but destroying this place, tearing things up, fighting with the police, that's not going to bring anything back. That's not going to make things better. All that's going to do is give people an excuse to say we can't handle ourselves, that we don't deserve respect." The arena remained absolutely silent. Even the security personnel and police officers stood motionless, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening. James continued, his words coming from a place of genuine emotion. "The man who we lost, he believed in peaceful change. He believed we could be better, do better. He believed in us. And the best way we can honor him, the best way we can show that his message mattered, is by proving we're strong enough to control ourselves, disciplined enough to make the right choices, even when we're hurting." Television viewers across Boston sat transfixed. Parents who had been preparing to send their children to bed kept them up to watch. Community leaders who had been making contingency plans for potential disturbances paused in their preparations. Police officers in stations throughout the city gathered around television sets, watching a performer do what all their training and equipment couldn't do, reach people through authenticity and shared humanity. In the arena, you could see the transformation happening. Faces that had been tight with anger began to soften. Postures that had been aggressive became more relaxed. The young people who had rushed the stage earlier now stood in the aisles, not threatening, just listening. James had created a space where grief could be acknowledged without turning into rage, where frustration could be expressed without resulting in destruction. He had given the crowd permission to feel everything they were feeling, while simultaneously asking them to choose a higher path. It was a masterclass in leadership, in using influence for something far more important than entertainment. But James Brown knew that words, no matter how powerful, would only carry so far. The night was still young, and emotions could shift quickly. He needed to give the audience an outlet, a way to release the energy that had been building inside them. He turned to his band and nodded. "Let's do Say It Loud," he said. The musicians understood immediately. They launched into one of James's most recent hits, a song that had become an anthem, a declaration of pride and dignity that resonated deeply with the community. As James sang, something remarkable happened. The aggressive energy that had threatened to explode into chaos transformed into something else. Collective pride, shared identity, and unified purpose. People sang along with every word, their voices joining together in a powerful chorus that echoed through the arena and out into the streets, where others listened on radios and through open windows. The song became more than entertainment. It became catharsis, therapy, healing. James performed with everything he had, pouring his own grief and frustration into every note, every movement, every scream. The band responded with equal intensity, creating a wall of sound that was simultaneously aggressive and controlled, angry and purposeful. The performance continued for another hour, each song carefully chosen to maintain the balance James had created, acknowledging the pain while channeling it into something constructive. He alternated between high-energy numbers that let people release their emotions through movement and slower, more introspective songs that gave space for reflection. Between songs, he spoke to the audience like a friend, sometimes like an older brother, occasionally like a father figure, but always with respect and understanding. "I'm proud of you," he said at one point. "I'm proud of how you're handling yourselves tonight. You're showing the whole city, the whole country, that we can be trusted, that we have dignity, that we deserve respect." The words had a visible effect. You could see people standing taller, shoulders back, faces reflecting a sense of pride that had been missing earlier. James had given them something precious, not just a concert, but a sense of agency, a feeling that they had chosen the right path rather than having it imposed on them by authority. As the show moved toward its conclusion, James delivered what would become one of the most famous performances of his career. He collapsed on stage in apparent exhaustion, the physical toll of the intense performance finally overwhelming him. Danny Ray rushed out with the famous cape, draping it over James's shoulders as he kneeled on the stage. But then, in the signature move that audiences loved, James threw off the cape and sprang back to his feet, launching into another verse with renewed energy. He repeated the sequence 3 times, each resurrection more dramatic than the last, each revival drawing louder cheers from the crowd. It was pure theater, certainly, but it was also symbolic, a representation of resilience, of refusing to stay down, of finding the strength to continue even when everything seemed impossible. The audience understood the metaphor, whether consciously or unconsciously. They were watching someone demonstrate that setbacks didn't have to be permanent, that exhaustion didn't mean defeat, that it was possible to get back up again and again, no matter how many times life knocked you down. The final song ended with James and his entire band pushing themselves to absolute limits, creating a wall of sound and energy that left everyone breathless. As the last note faded, the audience exploded into applause that lasted several minutes. People weren't just clapping for the performance. They were celebrating something larger, acknowledging that they had collectively made a choice that night, that they had demonstrated strength through restraint rather than through destruction. James stood at the center of the stage, arms raised, acknowledging the crowd, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his processed hair disheveled, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had given absolutely everything they had. But his eyes sparkled with something else, relief, pride, and hope. Pride. Behind him, the band members embraced each other, knowing they had been part of something historic. The security personnel and police officers, who had been preparing for the worst, now stood almost relaxed, some of them actually smiling. In the broadcast booth, the production crew let out collective sighs of relief. The director looked at his team and simply said, "We did it." In homes throughout Boston, families sat in front of their television sets, many with tears in their eyes. Parents hugged their children. Neighbors called each other to share their reactions. Community leaders who had been braced for the worst now began to believe that perhaps the worst could be avoided. Mayor White, still in his office, finally allowed himself to lean back in his chair, a slight smile crossing his previously tense face. His gamble had paid off. The decision to broadcast the concert, controversial as it had been, had worked. People who might have taken to the streets stayed home, channeled their emotions through the shared experience of watching the performance, felt heard and acknowledged in ways that prevented the frustration from turning into action. The experiment had succeeded beyond anyone's hopes. Outside the arena, the streets remained quiet. No windows were broken that night, no confrontations erupted. The city that had been on the edge of chaos had pulled back, choosing a different path. It wasn't that the anger disappeared or that the grief was resolved. Those feelings remained, deep and real. But for one night, music had provided an alternative outlet, and one man's words had reached people in ways that official statements and police presence never could have. The impact of that night extended far beyond Boston. News outlets across the country reported on the peaceful conclusion to what could have been a disaster. Other cities, dealing with their own tensions, took note of what had happened. The concert became a case study in crisis management, in the power of cultural figures to influence social dynamics, in the possibility of using art and entertainment as tools for social cohesion rather than mere distraction. James Brown's reputation, already legendary, took on new dimensions. He wasn't just an entertainer anymore. He was a leader, a voice of reason, someone who had proven that real strength came from control rather than aggression, from bringing people together rather than tearing things apart. The performance would be remembered, analyzed, discussed, and celebrated for decades to come. Video footage of the moment when James stopped the show and addressed the crowd would be replayed countless times, studied in classrooms, referenced in documentaries, and held up as an example of leadership under pressure. But perhaps more importantly, the young people who were in that arena that night would carry the memory with them for the rest of their lives, remembering the night when they chose dignity over destruction, when they proved that they could be trusted, when one man believed in them enough to speak to them with respect rather than condemnation.